Welcome to the Unlist. Today we are talking about the Bogeyman. Yes, I said it, the Bogeyman. What is the Bogeyman in reference to fragrances? Well, more so in regards to the online fragrance community than people outside of it, since most average people don't even know what's in their perfumes, or they think the notes are the materials, and they typically don't care. But with all of the pseudo-intellectuals and self-proclaimed know-it-alls that inhabit the online spaces, particularly on social media or in forum sites like Base Notes and Fragrantica, you have a lot of people who have latched on to particular names of certain aromatic compounds, typically synthetic ones, right? Not natural materials. You'll never see sandalwood be called a Bogeyman, but a lot of times these so-called armchair experts on perfumery will name drop these materials and then go on with an almost religious level of superstition and blame these materials for all that is wrong with modern perfumery. And what's really funny is this is not even a modern concept. This has been happening since the internet first started having online communities. So when Base Notes was a news site, when Badger and Blade was the place most guys hung out and talked about cologne, Makeup Alley, right, for the ladies. Fragrantica was just getting off the ground. You know, Facebook was still new. Twitter was still called Twitter back then and had square icons instead of circular ones. That's gone back a few years. But people on these early platforms, even back then, were name dropping these aromatic compounds, these synthetic materials 9 times out of 10, and then blaming them for everything that is wrong with the state of modern perfumery, when in fact, the real problem couldn't be further from that. It's not the quality or perceived lack thereof on these materials. It's entirely based on the way they are used, okay? And furthermore from that, it isn't even so much about the way they're used in regards to the perfumer has to use them this way. It's the fact that they are intentionally wielded in the ways that they are encountered in modern perfumery that makes them feel so harsh, so dissonant, so disconnected from the rest of the fragrance. And usually this is the result of corporate oversight, micromanagement, and when perfumes are built to an extreme minimized cost, and on top of that, they're trying to maximize perceived bang for buck, you know, projection, longevity, physical metrics of performance against a low budget. So you oftentimes get individual potent materials that are intentionally overdosed to carry the rest of the perfume when there's not enough materials budget to go around or not enough R&D time allowed to really blend a perfume properly. It has to be done on the cheap, on the quick, bang it out by Friday, keep it under $5. This is what we want. It has to be this. And that is the root cause of why a lot of modern perfumes, even going back 20 years, since the early 2000s, sometimes you may even say late 80s and 90s, depending on the material. But it is never the material's fault. It is always the oversight that results in these fragrances that end up creating these bogeymen in the minds of collectors, enthusiasts who know a little bit about the world of perfumery, enough to be dangerous, let's say, to propagate misinformation. They know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be useful. So this video is going to more or less dispel that. I would like everyone who follows my YouTube, there's not a lot of you out there, but I would like you to really sit back and listen to what I have to say. I have had this conversation on Instagram via live stream, but those are big 2-hour bloated affairs full of segues and tangents, not as to the point as my YouTube videos. So I can't expect you to go back and watch that. So I'm going to ask you to watch this. You already understand the point I'm going to make because I just made it, and that these materials take the blame unfairly. No perfume material is really designed to smell bad. They just happen to smell bad when they're handled in a way that is callous, when they are handled in a way that exploits their qualities to the detriment of everything else, okay? And that isn't even the perfumer's fault, because a lot of times, as I said, the perfumer knows what's going to happen when they dose these materials at these quantities, but because their hands are tied, they are effectively puppets at that point. The strings go up from their fingers to the marketing people and the accountants and the creative directors and the shareholders above them who demand profit. They're the ones kicking down that we need this much projection. Our data, our AI, all our consumer testing, all of our figures say that we need A, B, and C together in the perfume, and we want it for this price. And then we're going to sell it for this much, and we want it to cost this much, and it has to give us this much performance, and it has to smell like A, B, and C combined together, because that's what the big blue computer tells us is going to make us $1 bazillion. And then the perfumer is basically following a recipe at that point. The perfumer is like reading the back of a cereal box and looking at the brownie recipe, how to combine the cereal to make the brownies. They have no creative input anymore. They have the slightest bit of wiggle room. Okay, maybe I can put a little more lavender in this, or a little less lavender and a little more rose. I've got some wiggle room here, but 95% of this has already been spelled out for me. I am no longer a chef at a restaurant. Okay, I am now a short order cook at Denny's. That's what I am. I'm at Waffle House, okay? I'm a short order cook at Waffle House. Even though I'm a prestigious, renowned Givaudan, IFF, whatever, Firmenich perfumer, I've got dozens of perfumes signed to my name. Some of them are bestsellers. People know my name, okay? I am a sought-after talent, but my talent is locked away behind all of the corporate micromanagement. And in effect, I am no longer being allowed to create a perfume like a chef would create a gourmet meal. I'm just following directions and being a short order cook at Denny's. I'm making your waffles and your eggs over easy, and that's all I'm allowed to do. So that's the big one right there that you need to realize. That is everything to do with why you get these massive chemical overdoses. It is not the quality of the materials. You can take a lot of natural materials and dose them very high and make unpleasant results. You don't see it very often because they're expensive. People are not going to overdose expensive natural materials. That's a waste of money. But they know what happens if they do. They've experimented, artisanal perfumers, niche perfumers who have access to things like real rose oil, real sandalwood. They know what happens if they put too much of that stuff in there. Too much civet paste, makes it stink. They know. So you can make anything smell bad if you put too much of it in a fragrance. It's just usually naturals never get put under that same scrutiny because they're not even being used to begin with in the fragrances. It's all synthetic because the cost is minimized. Now, we have that out of the way. That's the most important fact. Stop blaming the synthetics. Stop blaming the materials. And also, don't blame the perfumers either. It's not Olivier Cresp's fault that he makes a lot of generic garbage. It's not Alberto Morillas's fault that he makes a lot of generic garbage. They have a job to do. They are hired. They're doing the job. They're getting paid, okay? Now, they have more creative outlets. Olivier Cresp has done stuff for Lila Nur lately that's kind of more on the creative side. Alberto Morillas has his Mise en Serre brand that he can do more creative things with. So these perfumers are more and more going to the niche brands, going to start their own houses, doing things so they have creativity once again, because they know under the Codys and under the L'Oreals, under the LVMHs and all of those groups, they are getting their spirit quite literally crushed, spirit crushed, okay? They are cranking out Windex and Formula 409 and putting it in a $200 glass bottle and selling it to you as luxury, because that is the level of just cynical, dystopian, callous profit mongering that we have reached these days with designer brands and major brands in general. just the sheer inhumanity of it. It's depressing. It's the same thing that we see in the movie industry. Same thing we see in pop music. Art has been reduced to an algorithm, guys. Art across all fronts has been reduced to an algorithm. So why would perfume be any different? So again, don't blame the materials. They are not the bogeymen. Don't blame the perfumers. They are not the bogeymen. If you want to know who the bogeymen are the shareholders, the executive producers, the CEOs, the creative directors, okay, the lead accountants, the marketing managers, the guys who mood board everything, the guys who sit there and play around with AI stuff like Stable Diffusion, Chat GPT. Those are the real bogeymen, guys. Those are the bogeymen, not the materials, not the perfumers. The creatives are not to blame here. They are under the lash, if anything. They're the ones that are kind of being exploited, along with the materials. The materials are being exploited, and so are the perfumers. Now, let's talk about some of the more popular bogeymen, all right? The ones that I hear name dropped all the time. You've made it halfway through the video now. Let's talk about some of the most popular materials to hate on that don't deserve it. Some of the oldest ones are Kalone and dihydramycin, okay? When I first got into the game, 20 plus years ago, first started hanging out online talking about perfume, I would hear people always talk about Kalone and dihydramycin like they were the bogeymen. They were the original bogeymen, okay? Before ISO Super and Ambroxan and everything else, the original bogeymen of the online space that all the old guys yelling at clouds, all the old guys screaming at clouds going, but my oak moss, but my sandalwoods, but my civet, those guys, they were sitting there name dropping dihydramycin, which is really hard to say, by the way, dihydramycin and Kalone, and they were talking about these materials like they were the Antichrist, but not the case, okay? So first of all, dihydramycin goes all the way back to the 70s. And even though it was used very small amounts back then, it turned up in fragrances like the original Halston, women's Halston, by the way, not the men's, okay? It turned up in the Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, the original one from 73. Yeah, 1973, fragrance had dihydramycin in it. It was used to kind of give a soapiness to that fragrance. And anybody who's worn Paco Rabanne Pour Homme and knows that it has that soapy Irish Spring kind of feel to it, guess what, guys? That's dihydramycin. Yes, there's still oak moss in it. Yes, there's still rosewood in it, but it's got dihydramycin. That gives you that shimmer, that soapy shimmer that makes that fragrance what it is. Kalone really didn't start getting used more heavily until the 80s. I mean, you follow Edmund Runitska, he put a little bit of Kalone in his Parfum de Therese, which was not released to the public until after his death. But that had Kalone in it. So did, I think it was Diorella, had a little bit of Kalone in it as well. But no, it really wasn't until the 80s. We started seeing things like Low DC and New West, which is a Harry Fremont composition. Obviously, stuff later on into the 90s, we would see Escape would really utilize Kalone a lot, and there's also some Kalone in Cool Water, which is a Pierre Bourdon composition. Also dihydramycin in that fragrance as well, but that's well known. So the Kalone gives you this melony feeling at low doses, which is how you smell it in New West, Escape by Calvin Klein. Low doses gives you that cantaloupe kind of melon feel. Runitska liked it for that reason too. Higher doses, it gets more metallic, sharper, more metallic, more piercing. And you'll find that the case as you further into the 90s. The Kalone gets overdosed to create that sharp sort of, piercing ozonic effect, really. And that piercing ozonic effect is not a thing that a lot of older guys liked at that time. They liked rounder, more plush fragrances. So suddenly, this pierce, acrid, ozonic feel running through a fragrance, which was trendy at the time, was like, anathema for them. And of course, Yeah, it is Kalon's fault, but it's not the material itself, it's how much of it's in there because it was being overdosed. In the same way, too much dihydromercenol makes a fragrance very filmy, right? Like cool water gets very filmy, like bath water. So a lot of folks like that, but some folks don't. Then we move into the 2000s, and the Bogeyman switched out. Kalone and dihydromercenol were kind of left alone. And we started seeing people pick on ISOE Super. ISOE Super was the big one. Everyone wants to throw ISOE Super under the bus, but, you know, it's kind of like MSG. I've done a video on it that you can watch, actually, separately, just about the material on its own. And ISOE Super by itself has to be dosed incredibly high to have any kind of smell, really. What it's typically doing is it's boosting something else. The ISOE Super is used usually to boost a cedar material, or it's used to boost a patchouli material, or some other more aromatic, woody, verdant kind of material. And the ISOE Super just kind of gives it more radiance, gives it more sillage, gives it more projection. So it's like a volume enhancer. It's literally MSG. Like you sprinkle MSG in your food to increase the umami flavor, right? It's very commonly used in Asian dishes, which don't contain a lot of meat. A lot of Asian dishes rely primarily on sauces and vegetables, and the meat portions are very small. So they use the MSG to cheat because it adds that meaty umami flavor. Well, ISOE Super started becoming larger and larger in the perfumes to the point where it was like half of the formula for some fragrances. All right. And Jean-Claude Elena likes to use it. Christine Nagel likes to use it. Mathilde Laurent likes to use it. Okay. Bertrand Duchefort also loves using ISOE Super. He used a lot of it in certain Amouage fragrances like Jubilation 25. Has a very large slug of ISOE Super in it as well. But those fragrances all smell good to most people. Most folks don't have a problem with them. But because the name was thrown out there, ISOE Super, and it does sound like a cleaner, right? It sounds chemical, because it is a chemical. You get all the same guys screaming at clouds, name dropping the ISOE Super, and it's to blame for all that is wrong. Not really. Yeah, it got overdosed a lot. Probably shouldn't have been, but I mean, it's not a bad smelling material, guys. You know, you dose it up high enough, it does kind of smell like rubbing alcohol. You put too much of it in there, but anything smells terrible when you dose it really high. And then, of course, Ambroxan. Ambroxan is the most ridiculous of the bogeymen, in my opinion. And the reason why I think Ambroxan is such a ridiculous thing to make into a bogeyman, oh, it's the Ambroxan. All these Ambroxan bombs, all the blue fragrances that have all this Ambroxan, it's the Ambroxan's fault. Okay. This shows these so-called know-it-alls how much they actually know. They haven't bought Ambroxan crystals and made any kind of dilution out of them. They haven't actually put their money where their mouth is and smelled the stuff. But it is very well documented that Ambroxan smells good, okay? Even in like 10% solution, it smells really good, all right? And when you dose it really high, it can start to have a bit of a staticky effect. But typically it has that clean, oceanic, sort of salty, musky vibe. And it is just the perfect thing to boost the levels of a clean fragrance. You're trying to make a transparent fragrance. You're trying to focus on the violet leaf or the citruses, or you're trying to focus on the lavender materials, or you've got some kind of brine accord in there. You're trying to do something like an Aqua de Jo, okay? Even Bleu de Chanel. And you want those top notes and those heart notes to really sing, right? You don't want to put heavy, fat, pasty, thick, rich labdanum. You don't want to put civet. You don't want to put any of those creamier white musks in there. You don't want to put galaxolide in there, okay? You don't want to put nitromusks in there. You want those top and heart notes to really stand out. How do you do that? Well, ISOE is really good for the woody materials, like I said. It pronounces them. So the Ambroxan is really good for the florals and really good for the citruses. And if you pay attention, you put on your Professor Peabody helmet and you pay attention, you'll know that Creed used a lot of Ambroxan because they made a lot of classic French citrus floral fragrances. Everything from Milsim Imperial, a Bordeaux composition, Silver Mountain Water, another Bordeaux composition, Neroli Sauvage, another Bordeaux composition. This goes on and on and on. All of these fragrances rely very heavily on Ambroxan. And that's why they have that beautiful, transparent, fresh, vivid smell. You know, Royal Water, one of my favorites, juniper and rose with a salty ambergris vibe. Well, there's a lot of Ambroxan in that, pumping the shit out of that top note arrangement with the juniper, with the gin note, with the rose. And the Ambroxan is to blame for making that fragrance great, okay? So people do need to get their heads out of their asses and stop blaming the Cetilox and the Orchinox or, you know, or the Ambrox Super or whatever. It's not their fault. A lot of times people falsely attribute Ambroxan as the problem. What they're really smelling are woody ambers. They're smelling the woody ambers. This is where I'll wrap up the video because I don't like to run over 25 minutes. But the woody ambers are really to blame for a lot of the harshness, the scratchiness, the irritating qualities, and also to an extent the more metallic materials like sclarine, which is derived from sage, akagala wood, which comes from patchouli. A lot of these heavy, metallic, sharp, scratchy, woody materials are what you think is the Ambroxan, what you think is the Isoe Super, but it isn't. So you've got a bogeyman is to blame here, a chemical bogeyman is to blame here, but you've got the wrong one. You've got the wrong one. And even then, I'd be less willing to blame the materials than I would their dosage. And that kicks uphill to the chain of command, right? Because the perfumer probably doesn't want to put that much ambroxanide in there. I'm sure if the perfumer had it his way or her way, they wouldn't put that much norlimbinol in there. They wouldn't put any of that stuff in there quite to that level. But they're being made to. They're being made to. Because it's a volume pumper. It's a sillage pumper. It's cheap. It's very effective. It gets the job done. You know, you can put a whole lot in there for not a lot of money and make a total banger of a fragrance, right? A club banger. And people love it. Ethyl maltol is another one. People don't realize that all that bubblegum sweetness, it's the ethyl maltol. It's nothing else. And ethyl maltol is the same thing that is found in bubblegum. So it quite literally has a bubblegum smell because it is what is found in commercial bubblegum. Okay? But back on the woody ambers, which is where I'm closing this. They are extremely potent. And they should only be dosed very low because they are meant to provide, as you might expect, a woody, ambery feel to the base of a perfume. But they are not meant to be the sole base material or to be the primary base material. So when you dose them at those levels, they become like sandpaper. They become like someone's lighting a fire with tinfoil, smoking pills outside, right? They have that horrible electrical wire burning your house down kind of smell because they're not supposed to be dosed that high. But the perfumers, again, their hands are tied and they're made to do it. So once again, the real bogeyman is not the material. The real bogeyman is not the perfumer. It's the guy upstairs calling the shots. He is the one you need to really be wagging your fingers at, okay? This has been The Unlist. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Stop blaming the materials.